Hi, everybody. My name is Alberto Giordano. I'm the professor of geography at Texas State University and the 2018-2019 president of UCGIS. Today we have a panel, and I apologize for the size of the screen, but that's honestly the best I could do, sorry. Now, today's panel is about ethics, the ethics of the GIS profession. And the idea today was to bring in panelists that are from academia, but also not from academia, and that they could bring the perspective of the GIScience, on the GIScience profession from their professional organization. And so we will have three presentations of about 20 minutes each, followed by a 30-minute Q&A with the public. And I've asked the panelists to basically comment on their organization code of conduct or initiative related to ethics in to the professional ethics in GIScience, and then comment on one or more studies. That's what we are doing. So we talked about the duration of the Please note that if you scroll down your screen, you should see a document that has additional information about the session, including the links and short bios, if you're interested in this. Now, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and after the panelist presentation, we'll proceed to have a discussion, including your questions. Okay, so now the participants include Katie Camp and Marie Price on behalf of the American Geographical Society, Charles Brady, who is from the GIS Certification Institute in the city of Ardmore in Oklahoma, and Camilla Cantor, who is here representing the U.S. Geospatial Intelligence Foundation. Just a little bit about these participants. Catherine Kahn is the manager of sponsored projects and initiative at the American Geographical Society, where she has managed the Ethical GEO initiative since 2019. Mary Price is Professor of Geography and International Affairs at the George Washington University, and she is the current president of the American Geographical Society. She will discuss with Katie the AGS Ethical GEO initiative. Charles Brady III has served as the GIS coordinator for the city of Ardmore in Oklahoma since 2000. He's also, apart from this role, he is also the appointed municipal representative for the Oklahoma State Geographic Information Council. And here is representing the GIS, the GISCI Certification Institute. Camilla Cantor is the Vice President of Academic Affairs and Professional Development at the United States Geospatial Intelligence Foundation. At UCGIS, she's primarily responsible for leading the foundation collegiate accreditation, professional certification, and science and technology program. So without further ado, let's start with the presentation in the order that I've read the short bios for the participants. So we'll start with the American Geographical Society. And Katie or Mary or both, it's your turn.
Thanks, Alberto. I'm going to start, and then Katie, and then I get to close out. So thank you for inviting us. This is a topic that is near and dear to the work of the American Geographical Society over the last couple of years. Next. So the American Geographical Society has been around since 1851, and a lot of the issues we're talking about today weren't even on the most forward-thinking person at the time. But our mission is to convene a diverse global community of innovators, thinkers, and practitioners to create and curate geographical knowledge, to advance geographical science and technologies, and to address society's challenges and opportunities. And we sum this up as to be a champion of geography for the benefit of society. And if you're going to be a champion of geography for the benefit of society, you better address some of the ethical dimensions that are embedded in the geospatial tools that have been created over the last couple decades. Next. So this is a timeline of some of the work the Society has done in the last couple of years, and I will go into some more detail in the presentation. In 2019, through a grant from the Omidyar Network, we began the Ethical Geo Initiative, and a lot of the work we're talking about that is embedded within Ethical Geo. Part of that work also is working closely with youth mappers and believing that training people and using geospatial tools and open source platforms in all sorts of settings around the world is extremely important. And with that, we have a relationship where we've built an academy and geo-badging, which Katie will talk about. In 2020, as COVID launched, we received funds from the Henry Luce Foundation to convene a location task force, which will deal directly with our case study of the use of cell phones and tracking. And then I want to conclude with talking about the work we're doing with Benchmark to launch the Locus Charter, which is the beginning of a discussion. We're asking organizations to sign on with the founding principles of how geographical and geospatial information should be used. And if you were lucky, you got to see our geoconvergence workshop at NSF just last month, which if you're interested in it, you can look on our webpage. Next. I think I'll turn it over to Katie to talk about Ethical Geo.
Thanks, Marie, and thanks UCGIS again for having us. So as Marie mentioned on the previous slide, Ethical Geo was founded in the summer of 2019 through a partnership with Omidyar Network, with the goal of activating scholars and practitioners in geography and geospatial sciences to launch a global dialogue that shines a light on their best ideas about both the ethical challenges and opportunities posed by many geospatial technologies and data sources that are currently reshaping our society. So we conceived the following 5 priorities to organize our thoughts and research when we were thinking about Ethical Geo. The first is privacy, which is, of course, paramount in most of our conversations here at the intersection of ethics and geo. Along with privacy, we have politics, people, planet, and property. And I would encourage everyone to check out the Ethical Geo Knowledge Repository, which is a curated resource library of resources that are organized among these 5 themes that kind of can contribute to the conversations and research of Ethical Geo. And next slide, please. Thanks. So in the summer of 2019, when we launched the initiative, we also launched a national search for 7 Ethical Geo Fellows who would pursue individual research projects working to identify both those benefits and opportunities and also the potential harmful consequences of geospatial tools. So from this national search, we wound up with 7 fellows chosen from a mix of professional and research backgrounds, different sectors of society, government, academia, industry, etc. And they pursued these projects through the end of 2020. So today we wanted to highlight the work of 2 of our fellows, and we'll do that quickly, but we do encourage everyone to check out the work of all of our Ethical Geo fellows, kind of can contribute a lot to our conversation today. Next slide, please. So first, we wanted to talk about Ms. Erica Hagen, who is the director of the Map Kibera Trust and the Ground Truth Initiative. And through her Ethical Geo project, Erica developed a framework for ethical open mapping in vulnerable communities. She did this by synthesizing and applying lessons learned from existing data principle frameworks, including FAIR, CARE, and also PGIS, or Participatory GIS. And she created a guideline advancing focus areas of respect, which includes ensuring consent and safeguarding privacies, communities being mapped. Benefit, which ensures the mapping project benefits the place that is being mapped. And also justice, which aims to create local opportunity, capacity, and sustainability, as well as mitigate burdens and potential harms any mapping project could cause. So Erica's framework is in draft on our website, and she is still soliciting input. So everyone's encouraged to go check it out and provide any feedback to Erica via the contact on our website there. Next slide, please. Next, we have Dr. Dara Seidel, who's an associate professor of GIS at Colorado Mountain College. And through Ethical Geo, Dara created a geo-privacy video series that's meant to be used as a resource for educators who are teaching ethical issues related to the collection of location data to their students. And her videos confront a variety of different case studies, including and highlighting kind of any of the risks of privacy incursions when using location data. So that runs the gamut from public safety officials falsely identifying crime suspects to using GPS data to track the shopping habits of private citizens. So there's a variety of resources there, and they're all accompanied by associated curriculum supplements, which are really fantastic resources for any educator looking to introduce geoprivacy in the classroom. And next slide, please. So Dara, Erica, and our other 5 fellows projects are available on our website, as I mentioned, ethicalgeo.org/thoughtleaders. And they have some really fantastic resources that I would encourage everyone to peruse. Next slide. Switching gears a bit, I wanted to introduce our partnership and focus on the work of our partners at Youth Mappers. As Marie mentioned, Youth Mappers, many of you have probably heard of it, but they're doing fantastic things to kind of advance the work of Geo for Good around the world. They were founded in 2016 as a network of student-led chapters using geospatial technologies to directly address development challenges across the globe. And they currently have 269 chapters at universities in 60 countries. So we wanted to highlight just one current project of the many, many that they're doing. But this is a fantastic example of what they do in the good for development around the world. So this in particular, this project is mapping fundamental spatial features to speed up efforts to design and install mini grids, electrification grids, in rural areas in Sierra Leone. Currently, there's very limited data on existing power system distribution networks in Sierra Leone that has been inhibiting the design and installation process there. So local Youth Mapper chapters are using both satellite and street level imagery to map the location of these towns, nearby road networks, and also existing utility poles to speed up the feasibility and design phase for installing these microgrids and delivering electricity to many different remote communities across the country. It's been really successful so far, but it's just starting out. But they're hoping that this will serve as a model to scale up electrification activities across the African continent to advance the UN SDGs. Very exciting. Next slide. And AGS has been a partner of Youth Mappers since its inception. We've supported various projects and initiatives over the course of in the last couple of years. Since 2019, we've served as the credentialing organization for the Youth Mappers Academy through our Geo Badges program. So the Youth Mappers Academy launched just this year to all Youth Mapper chapters around the world. And as these students complete modules, AGS will issue Geo Badges that serve as kind of professional credentials for these students to use on their LinkedIn and their resumes, et cetera, to demonstrate new skills in Geo and GIS in particular, mostly through OpenStreetMap. We're also supporting the development of the Everywhere She Maps program, which is an activity of Youth Mappers supported by USAID's Geo Center. And they're working on implementing mapping and geospatial data activities that invest in women and girls all around the world. They're also running a leadership program for women in tech and supporting a network of regional ambassadors focusing on building local capacity for female mapping community. We're really excited about the future of this project and really grateful to be involved. And so we would encourage all the student members of UCGIS to check out the work of Youth Mappers. Their website is youthmappers.org and see the many different examples that we didn't get to touch on today. And also their very robust code of ethics, which serves as a fantastic example for anybody looking to develop their own. And with that, I'll pass back to Marie.
Thanks, Katie. So one of the challenges Alberto gave us is to consider a case study, and the one on tracking mobile phones and mobility research was one that immediately appealed to us because we, in fact, engaged in a dialogue in Blue Ribbon panels as COVID was becoming an international issue in early 2020. There was enormous enthusiasm in the tech sector that, oh, we can track people with their phones and you can be alerted if you've been exposed to someone with COVID. And in a theoretical world, this sounded like a great idea. What were the problems? Next slide. So through the work of, through funding from the Luce Foundation, in the late spring and summer of 2020, we launched the Location Tech Task Force, where we spoke to people from geospatial companies, from local governance, from people in ambassadors and various stakeholders, obviously from the health profession, of what would be the potential value and be the problems with tracking people's exposure to COVID with cell phones. And some really important issues arose from these panels. And if you'd like to hear more about them, this is also tied to our ethical geo information. But at the key was, what were the design principles? Who is developing the system? Is it a private company? Is it a healthcare agency? Is it a government? What are the various biases in the software itself of who gets selected and who isn't, and how is it communicated? One of the things that really came out was the belief that while private sector might be capable of creating these tools, there was an interest in governance controlling them, or at least regulating them. And not many countries really adopted this strategy, but Norway was one. They started, people could sign up, they could be tracked and notified. And then after several months, they abandoned the project, that is the Norwegian government, in part because they found that they didn't know in the long run how would they maintain the data? Did they want to maintain the data? What were the sort of larger complicating factors of getting this information? And then from the geospatial side, there were some very important insights of people and individuals who use this preferring relative location using Bluetooth, so that you maybe passed somebody with COVID, but you didn't, or spent several minutes with someone with COVID, but you didn't necessarily know exact location. And certainly there was much more preference for the relative location of people rather than exact location. And exact location brought in all kinds of concerns about privacy, vulnerability, and the concerns of vulnerable populations, be they children, elderly, along racial or ethnic lines, LGBTQ communities. There were so many reasons why people would not participate in such a system. And then there was a really interesting question about the data itself and who owns the data. And actually, Father Michael Rozier, who's also an ethical geo fellow and a Catholic priest, a public health official, a public health professor, talks a lot about the separation between the person and the personal data, and where is that line? And I think we're still wrestling with that. I think the medical community has a much stronger practice and understanding of how to maintain personal data. But some of the issues that came up is that if such data are collected, it should be minimal, and it also should be eventually deleted. It shouldn't be maintained in a storage facility. And then the confidence that maybe government or health professionals might do this, but would private sector. So in our dealings with this particular question tied to COVID, we found so many more challenges and obstacles rather than easy adaptation and use of such technology. Next. So I briefly want to talk about the Locus Charter. This is an initiative AGS is doing with Benchmark, and we are in the early stages of basically creating and having organizations sign on to some of the founding principles with the goal of ultimately getting organizations and to endorse the Locus Charter. Next slide. So the process of the Locus Charter is realizing that geospatial tools and geographical information is more accessible and used by more and more different players all over the world, but there are still a lack of clear guidelines. So last year, various workshops were held in the region shown, asking some of the consequences and barriers, what were some best practices, what are some of the innovations, and what should be the founding principles of using these tools. Next slide. And the Locus Charter then came up with these 10 founding principles, and from realizing the opportunities, understanding impacts, to do no harm, protect privacy, minimize data. I don't need to read them all to you. What we're trying to do right now at AGS is get this idea of the Locus Charter out, have organizations sign on to it, contribute to designing and refining the founding principles with the intent of ultimately coming up with an agreement, a charter that can be endorsed and practiced. So that about takes all our time. I think there's just a concluding slide. If you want to learn more about the Locus Charter, you can get involved, and we also would welcome your input. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie, Marie, and for those who joined us a little bit later, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat for our participant. At the end of the three presentation, we'll have a Q&A discussion. And also at the bottom of the page, there is additional information about this session. Thank you. And so our next speaker is Charles Brady. And let me just try to move to the next and see if I can get a better view for you. Can you see a bigger screen now?
I can't right now. But honestly, that's not really a major problem because a lot of this stuff has a lot of content on here that's a lot of text that I don't expect everybody to read. And no, I'm not going to read it all to you.
Okay.
So we're good. I can work with that. Charles Brady here, GIS coordinator with the city of Ardmore in Oklahoma. If you don't know where that's at, if you were to draw a straight line between Dallas, Texas and Oklahoma City, I'm the dot right in the middle on the interstate. My town is a population of just shy of probably 40,000. I've been here for a while. I've also sat on several different positions on the state and regional committees. Work heavily with 911, work heavily with deploying GIS and pretty much every aspect of municipal mapping and state mapping that's out there. So with that being said, I'm speaking today on ethics from a professional aspect. I know a lot of this is really heavy on academics, but this is from the professional side where we look at it and we go, we truly are the holders of the ethics that we should lead by example. Being a GISP should kind of set you apart a little bit and show that you do have a certain responsibility to the profession, to your job, to society, to take and represent and utilize the tool of GIS as a profession, not just a tool. You should be able to have, make decisions with good discretion and conduct. So that being said, we'll go ahead and move to the next slide real quick. Some of y'all may know who GISCI is or what GISCI is. Cut it real quick, it is the professional. It's someone who utilizes GIS in their profession, but that truly is their profession. It's not just a tool. I know many years ago, whenever GIS really got started and got deployed in various aspects, whether it's municipal, whether it's state, local government, a lot of times that was utilized as a tool, and whenever it was brought on as a profession, there's a lot of things that you have to consider. Certain things like projections, certain things that are detail-oriented, certain things that are database-oriented. They span across the entire genre of what GIS is, and they're not just industry-specific to public utilities or whether you're looking at other different specific professions, but it is GIS as a profession in its own. That's why GISCI was created. The initial concept was back in '97, and we're looking at through full fruition coming to 2015 whenever there was an exam to get your GISP. It's not just extra letters at the end of your name. It really does mean something to the ones who truly have gone through it. And one of the huge components that they have to sign, every GISP has to sign, is an ethics portion. You have to have an ethics portion that you do sign and an ethics agreement that you do sign. It's a code of rules and conduct acknowledgement form. You can see that GISPs truly should be the leaders out there, and there are a lot of them out there in the profession. There are tracks as GISCI has continued to grow that tend to incorporate academics and let there be an easy segue from the academic side into the professional side as the maturation happens from graduates coming into the profession. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and move to the next slide real quick. What exactly are ethics? Boy, that is a hard one. That is an easy question that has a hard answer. It's probably one of the easiest things to define on saying doing the right thing at the right time, whether people are looking or not. The hard thing is interpreting that whenever you look at daily operations. If you look at the rules of conduct and the code of ethics, it's kind of obligations to and a set of rules and code of ethics for. The rules of conduct you kind of see is highlighted over there in the red side, that is the shall nots and the shalls. It's the hard-coded law legal side that we all look at, and if you read through them, truly they make common sense. When it's an ethical thing, most of the time it's clear-cut in its initial interpretation. Now, that being said, there's a lot of gray area where you truly have to look at the entire comprehensive case to see if there's an ethics question. It may be something that is just kind of questionable on the outside, but when you start looking really into it, it's not a questionable deal, or it could be just the inverse of that. But the rules of conduct, they show real quick that it is an obligation to society, employers, colleagues. It's the professional courtesy and the responsibility that we all have as a true GISP. When you look at the code of ethics, that's a little different. That's truly what the GISP person should take and operate under. It's the positive to-do list. It's what you should do. That is one of the things that you can see most of the time when you look at those two different lists. There's a correlation. You know, you see society, you see employers and funders, colleagues and individuals in society. But the green one is the one that GISCI generally focuses on, because that's not the regulatory you shall and you shall not. It's this is what you should do, and this is how to do it, and this is how you conduct yourself in a professional manner, and how you represent your data in a manner that is knowledgeable and you have discretion in knowing how to use it correctly. If you've ever taken a statistics class, it's interesting to watch in a statistics class how you can take data and you can manipulate data to show whatever you would like to show. We all know that GIS utilizes statistics heavily, and it does it in a way where you can display information real well. If you want to take and twist that around, look at how you take a map that shows something good, and you're trying to show something good, and then you highlight that area in red. there's an implication in there that is it incorrect? Not necessarily, but generally you don't see red on a map as a good thing. You generally see green on a map as a good thing. So some of those small little things that you don't think about are what GISPs should take into consideration every day that they do their job. So the code is based basically on the ethical principle that you always treat others with the respect that they deserve, and not just a means to an end. Treat people like you would like to be treated. That's a common sense thing, but it's a shame we have to write that stuff down in today's society, but we do. And it's a good thing to have in the forefront of your mind. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide real quick. As it was mentioned, we had to have a case study. And this is something that is truly one of the ones that I look at as a case that I have not dealt with directly, but I have seen all of these players in motion and worked at all of these levels with these different players in motion. And I'll cut this to the chase real quick and kind of give you an idea and a comprehensive idea of the scenario. If you'd like to, you're more than welcome to read it. I'm sure that these slides will be available at the end of the presentation. But you kind of got three real key players in this scenario. One of them is the local GIS manager. He's the only GISP in his area. He is also the GIS manager that will basically kind of guide everything in his municipality as well as his county, because he is the one managing that data. The state 911 coordinator, they came on board. They are also a GISP. They recognized the local resource they had there, and they said, would you sit in on the bid discussions to be able to see who we can award the state contract to? As you go through this process, you see where the local manager had an idea of what there was a requirement. They also saw the contractor's qualifications, kind of from whenever you read through it, and the actual case studies at the bottom if you'd like to read the entire one. This is kind of a synopsis of it. But it came across to where the state 911 coordinator made a decision to go ahead and award the state contract to the contractor. And it made the local GIS individual kind of curious as far as why he chose them. There were several reasons why that wouldn't have been the one that raised to the top level. Whenever the local GIS manager started to look, they also noticed that the 911 coordinator for the state also was a previous employee of the contractor that won the contract. Right off the bat, that's going to make you think, raises red flags. Whether it does or not, it's going to make it look like there's impropriety somewhere in there. There may be, there may not be, but it does probably warrant some questions to be asked. So as you read through this, you can see this scenario, and you can see where the local individual had some questions, they asked the questions, and then the contractor, by the way, said, well, your data's not quite up to snuff, so we probably just need to recommend wiping through and just rebuilding all the data. Well, as a local individual GIS manager, I will say that would make my alarms go off. I'm going, something's probably not right. I'm going to ask more questions at that point in time. So you can see how the scenario was set up here. As you move on to the very next slide, we look at now what? What do you have options to do as a local GIS manager? So let's go ahead and move on to that next slide real quick. Whenever you look at the options, it's real easy to say, oh, there's a problem. The reason that person got the contract, previous employer, there's going to be some improprieties there. That's the first natural response. But then before you make a move, you really, truly, as a professional, you need to step back and be the devil's advocate. You need to be that third party that steps back before you make a move, before you say a thing to anyone else, and truly know where you stand. Can you truly be objective in this, or did you just take offense at the fact of, hey, he told me my data wasn't up to snuff? I can promise you, if you think your data is perfect, you haven't looked deep enough. It always has errors because it's always live data. It's always being worked on. So you need to truly introspectively look and see if you're truly standing where you think you are. Do you know the whole scenario? Because you may be seeing a small, very small window of this case that you probably don't know. There's another side to it, and it's going to cast that shadow just as far in one direction as you're seeing it in the other. You truly need to have a comprehensive knowledge and ask those questions. And anything that is a good, honest discussion or decision should be able to withstand the light of day. Whenever you ask those questions, there should be honest answers to them. So you can see as the progression rolls through with this, the thought is, well, do I need to take and report an ethics violation? Well, how do I go about that? Is there a legal method to how I file an ethics violation? Because the other individual who awarded the state contract, being the 911 coordinator for the state, they're a GISP. They should know better. But pause for just a moment. There's a professional courtesy that goes along with this. And that is truly, how would you like to be treated in this? Would you like people to jump to conclusions or come and discuss it with you and truly see what your options are? The professional courtesy goes a long way. Just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should. You might not be operating with the full set of knowledge that you think that you are. So go ahead and move to the next slide real quick. And I will say that you would all love to see in a scenario like this a real cut and dried, yes, this is how you proceed. That doesn't exist with ethics. There's no way that exists with ethics. You need to find more out about what's going on in the entire scenario, and then be respectful in the entire process. Realize that very possibly your opinion may be skewed as much as someone else's. Look for honest explanations, and then when those explanations are brought before you, truly look at them and understand them. Don't just look at them, toss them over to the side. Look at them and see, let's work through this. Let's see if there's some options on how we can take and reach that final terminal goal in a method that is going to help everyone involved. Common sense and courtesy can go a long ways throughout this process. This is one of those case studies that was very interesting because I can see, like I said, all the players in this, and I can see all of the loopholes to where there may not be any impropriety. There may not be. Way too small of a window to even come close to a judgment, way too small of a subset to be able to take and make any kind of decision aside from the fact of sit back, be quiet, and look more before you say a word. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide real quick. Now, here's the resources that are available online. Whenever you look at GISCI, the GIS Certification Institute, there are a lot of rules of conduct. There are a lot of code of ethics, and if you'd like to read through them, you're more than welcome to. There's the links right there. If you have any questions, you can email GISCI at info@gisci.org. You can see everything out there. If it's truly a good, honest endeavor, you should be able to take and see everything out there transparent. GISCI has done a very good job at making that available to the public. And if there truly is an ethics concern, there is a method and an avenue through GISCI to be able to take and work through that. That was one of the things that early on through GISCI, there was a heavy ethics lean because they knew the responsibility that the GIS professional holds. You never know where your data is going to end up. You could be sitting here one day drinking a cup of coffee and putting dots on a map or bringing data in from a server, and it's just something that you work on. And the next morning you see it on national television because of some disaster or something that came across. And heaven help you if you realize that someone's taken your data, twisted it, manipulated it, and not said the right thing because you know what's right in there. As a GIS professional, that's where you should have the discretion to be able to take and keep your metadata clean, to keep your data clean so there's no confusion from simply a misunderstanding. A lot of times, misunderstandings with data can happen real easy. It is complicated data that we work with on a daily basis. So in light of anything else, always use professional courtesy and discretion and lead by example. And so I'm sure we can have some discussion at the very end. If you would like to, feel free to contact me as well. And with that, I will say I believe that is my last slide. Isn't it, Alberto?
I think so. Hold on. Oh. Yeah, thank you, Charles.
Appreciate
it. The next speaker is Camelia Cantor from the U.S. Geospatial Intelligence Foundation. And Camelia, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Alberto, for the kind introduction. Thank you, UCGIS, as well, for inviting me here today. As you said, I represent today USGF and implicitly the Geospatial Intelligence community. We're a 501c3 educational foundation created in 2003 and trying to contribute to the growth and maturity of a fairly young but rapidly evolving discipline. Next slide. Given the audience today, I've seen a few people who I know, but the majority of the people I don't know. So I thought of starting with briefly with what is geospatial intelligence. There is a definition written in the US Code, but basically we're utilizing every subdiscipline of geography, and we overlap with many traditional disciplines, including cognitive science and ethics. We also involve domain knowledge. We focus on human impacts. And we also have an application of the art or tradecraft of the intelligence discipline that provides competitive advantage. In the past 25 years, the rapid growth of GIS, computer memory, and processing speed have enabled and accelerated the growth of the field of geospatial intelligence. So, next slide. In today's presentation, I will try to cover 3 topics pertaining to ethics and surveillance, regulatory frameworks, and also try to compare GIS versus joint analysts and the nature of ethical problems that the two groups are encountering. Next slide, please. Charles just gave us a very nice overview of what ethics are. From my perspective, we tend to think of ethics as an ancient philosophical construct. While the old definitions are still valid, the context, however, has changed significantly. Defining ethics is not necessarily, it's actually just the first step in the process. But in the field that evolves as rapidly as geospatial intelligence and overall the geospatial disciplines, and where geospatial analysis can have profound real-life implications, choosing a single starting point is a real challenge. As compared to my previous colleagues whose organization have a long history of building a profession, with USGF and the community, the GEOIN community, we're still young in our efforts to having geospatial intelligence recognized as a profession, both by internal and external communities. So to be honest, when comparing geospatial with other professions such as engineering, surveying, law, medicine, professionalization of the workforce is still an individual rather than an organizational-wide effort, which has an implicit impact on ethics and how they're embedded into our respective work. I'm really glad to see such efforts as those of AGS, UCGIS, and GISci moving towards establishing and enforcing, to some extent, ethical guidelines and codes of conduct. But as of now, with all the rapid technological shift, our focus goes beyond the scholarly place of ethics and is twofold. One, on the individual professional who needs to be able to recognize the situation and understand how his or her actions can affect the outcome. And the other one on the professional organizations and agencies to provide regulatory frameworks, as well as to encourage and promote learning, the moral skill to figure out what the right thing is. Next slide, please. So since the publication of 1984, I don't know if you remember, but the phrase Big Brother has come into common use to describe any prying or overly controlling authority figure and attempts by the government to increase surveillance. Usually surveillance and privacy are framed around Big Brother as the overweening state. And almost every time I visit the university and meet with college students in particular, I get a few in the audience questioning me about the government intent and ethical behavior tied to surveillance, tracking, denial, and deception. But the widespread use of facial recognition in private and enemy hands suggests an urgent danger, one that GEOINT analysts working for government or private contractors are specifically equipped to tackle. Mass surveillance, particularly the one that uses big data to eliminate all forms of privacy and individual choice, is now being implemented by unfriendly countries. We can now talk about China and its advanced state monitor, navigation, and surveying system, but also about a lot of US-based commercial uses with blurry ethical and privacy boundaries. Next slide, please. So we assume that geospatial technologies are inherently surveillance technologies. What does that mean? Think about the location data from your smartphone that could be used to invade your privacy. If you think back, I don't know if you're familiar, Jeremy Crampton, a well-recognized academic in the realm of ethics and geography, noted that an increasingly significant component of security discourse comes from a spatial or geographic standpoint. And the issue of security is often contrasted against issues of privacy and civil rights. And this is because technologies such as GPS, satellite remote sensing, and geographic information systems are inherently surveillance technologies. The data they produce may be used to invade the privacy of individuals and groups. Data gathered using geospatial technologies is also used to make policy as well as personal decisions. So going back to what Charles mentioned recently, when we have erroneous, poorly documented, or inappropriate data, that can have great consequences for individuals and society. Geospatial technologies have the potential to exacerbate inequities in society, insofar as large organizations enjoy greater access to technology, data, and technological expertise as compared to smaller organizations and individuals. Most importantly, within a huge high-velocity exchange of data environment, we're seeing an increased disconnect between the collector of data and the curator of data and the producer of the map, the end producer, with traditional cartographic knowledge being lost and information being created from secondary packages potentially already altered from an ethical standpoint, with intent or purely due to lack of fundamental knowledge and skills in cartographic competencies. Next slide, please. So moving into the regulatory frameworks, all this complex environment, ethics is really not what you do, but why you do it. Some humans, but not all, follow fundamental moral principles that provide some ethical boundaries. Culture and social constructs establish some rules, but the human nature creates numerous variations of how those rules are being interpreted and applied. Things get in particular complicated when those interpretations can lead to significant divergence of opinion, impacting decision-making in matters of national security. This is why regulatory frameworks are essential for ensuring compliance with basic standards. In some instances, the impact of regulatory as well as legal and ethical issues can be significant. So my organization, in particular USGF, we mirror the Code of Conduct, the principles of ethical conduct for government officers and employees, as well as the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency ethical standards for the geoing profession. The NGA's ethics program is administered within the NGA's Office of the General Counsel, which serves as the designated agency ethics official. We adhere to professional standards of independence, neutrality, informality, and confidentiality. And we're also committed to truth, lawfulness, integrity, stewardship, excellence, and diversity. USGF also follows several existing efforts, namely the Society of Competitive Intelligence Professionals Code of Ethics. And there's also an older document that provides a 7-step guide to help think through some complex ethical case studies. Next slide, please. So the questions we ask are what guides us ethically? Why are ethics important? And why a code of ethics? And we have several, it's like you can see several categories here, and I know the PowerPoint is going to probably be shared, so I'm not going to details here. But it's really, if you could move to the next slide, we as a community work with certain established legal frameworks and intelligence principles, and are also governed by tradecraft standards. These standards allow us to properly describe quality and credibility of underlying resources, sources, data, and methodologies, to express and explain uncertainties associated with some of the major analytic judgments, and to express the likelihood or probability of a result. Something to consider here as well, which I've seen in the past and a colleague of mine has shared recently, given the short time available to review briefings, for example, policymakers tend to focus more on the imagery than the story provided around it. This makes it even more important to ensure that the data is accurately presented and comes from trusted sources. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to share in the remaining time is that the nature of geospatial intelligence ethical problems and GIS analyst ethical problems is actually fundamentally different. My colleague and friend, Mr. Jack O'Connor from Johns Hopkins University, brought up a very interesting term, remit, which means the task or area of activity officially assigned to an individual or organization. Government geospatial analysts have a remit that includes a legal bound for their use of surveillance and reconnaissance technologies in answering specific intelligence questions. They also get training in the legal bounds of their work and work in organizations that have lawyers that protect the organizations from legal jeopardy. But as shared by my other colleague, Mr. Kevin Pomfret, many geospatial ethical issues result from individuals or organizations still not knowing the legal bounds of geospatial data licenses or the laws that pertain to the bounds on collection by different technologies in different countries or states. The remit and the law can act as the two artifacts for most geospatial issues. Furthermore, there's a cultural difference. GIS analysts are not trained to be suspicious of information from the onset of their careers, whereas geospatial intelligence analysts are. Geospatial analysts learn to be mindful that some observation can be intended to deceive, some were designed to be hidden, and some will be incomplete, perhaps forever, on account of poor collection. Next slide, please. So let's look at a scenario shared by Jack O'Connor as well, one that he's using for his classes at Johns Hopkins. I'm not going to read the entire scenario here, but if you could take some time to look at it, it illustrates that if your only source is joined, you're likely to have a very incomplete story that could be open to multiple interpretations. An analyst will need to seek other sources and to make sure that they're documenting the observations and not their assumptions. So if you go to the next slide, for example, in this particular scenario, and I know I don't have the best images, but I could share the links there. For example, the analyst should conduct some research and find, for example, about the Bamako Convention of 1991 and the Basel Accords of 1992, which create a story around the images. This example shows the limits of using only one intelligence source, of relying on imagery without the context narrative. And it brings up an important point to make, that geospatial intelligence needs both the arts and the science to support well-informed and ethical decision-making. If you go to the next slide, there's another case study I have here, also shared by Jack, that illustrates that any geospatial analyst and organization, no matter how small or large, has to understand the terms of its contract and its data licenses with a satellite provider. It also illustrates, like scenario one, the limits of using only one intelligence source. More importantly, in this particular case scenario, the analyst should understand that the legal risk is to the World Bank and potentially to the small geospatial company if either organization reports this finding outside the scope of the contract. So the way forward depends on all the parties knowing which organization owns the geospatial data, in this case satellite images, and which organization owns the analytic product, which may be a map, image, report, or all of the above. Most often, geospatial analysts encounter the ethically challenging information when they were seeking something else, and also the definition of evidence for a geospatial analysis has to meet one set of criteria, and the definition of evidence for a legal proceeding has to meet another one. So in the US government, for example, if there's even a hint of illegality, analysts are trained to tell their boss and inform the legal office of the civilian agency or military organization. And the last one, I don't know if I have the time to cover the case study, the one that actually Alberto has given me. I'll go very briefly through this. If you could, all right, this is the one. So this is a bit quite different and more sensitive case of geospatial analysis as compared to the previous two. If you could go to the next slide. And I have this particular case study with some examples from David DiBiase, so I would like to thank him for sharing the information. So there are several steps in the analysis. Step one, you state the problem, then you research and fact check. Then you identify relevant factors, develop a list of options, test them, make choices based on steps 1 through 5, and you review the steps from 1 through 6. If you go to the next slide, for example, I would like to start by stating the problem. I don't know if you had the time to really read the scenario. I'm going to just go over a few elements of this scenario. But the central question raised here by this case study is the moral and legal responsibility of the analyst participating in predicting civilian casualties from an urban missile attack. The problem arises in part by the way the question is being framed. So let's compare the two ways of framing the question. The first alternative, how many civilian casualties will result from a missile attack on the suspected urban headquarters? The second one is, will any civilian casualties result from a missile attack on the suspected urban headquarters? So as you see, the first question implies that the decision makers might accept some level of civilian casualties, whereas the second one suggests that the missile attack might not occur if civilian casualties would result. So it's really important to ask the right question. In any event, it is not clear what action would be taken once the analysis is undertaken, but a key question is whether the missile attack would be lawful or not. The next step is really checking the facts. And given the abstract nature of this exercise, it's not possible to check them. However, you can have a few examples where those questions could be potential questions to be asked. The next slide. So it's at this point identifying the relevant factors. You have to look into the law of armed conflict, the use of military force, and the ways being approached. For example, the United States Department of Defense definition of collateral damage needs to be checked. The Human Rights Watch, which provides detailed information on how principles should be applied, and also the International Committee of the Red Cross position. These are elements that any analyst will have to look into. Next slide. And then there's several options and several steps that an analyst would look into. I would just like to mention here, for example, a professional test that could be attempted, where, assuming the missile strike is lawful, conducting the analysis for decision makers would not violate any rule of professional conduct. However, if the missile attack was unlawful, the analyst's participation would be contrary to several professional rules. Moving on, option 4. Option 4, it provides the option of refusing to submit analysis and accept whatever consequences might follow. Well, we do have a recent example in our past years that you might be thinking about when just looking at this particular example. There's several tests that could be undertaken in order to make a decision. But it's really important for the analyst to understand what the consequences of their decisions mean. Moving to the next one, making choices based on steps 1 through 5. To the extent that the analysts believe the missile attack might be unlawful, option number 2 is the best course of action. But the analysts likely knew the nature of the work when they performed the work that they would perform when accepting employment with the agency. So unless they specifically knew that the missile attack was unlawful, they would be authorized to pursue option number 1. And the last one, the last step, reviewing steps 1 through 6, the key issue in this scenario is whether the missile strike was lawful. If it was unlawful, a professional should not support it. However, unless the missile strike is illegal under any circumstances, the analysis is necessary for informed decision-making by military commanders. Ultimately, participation is just a matter of individual conscience. So to conclude, given the pace at which we access and use geospatial information for decision-making, today, misinterpretation of data, limited fundamental cartographic knowledge, and the increasing gap between who collects data and who uses it can lead to some profound legal and ethical implications. Joint analysts are trained to deal with denial and deception, something that GIS practitioners should also strongly consider, potentially already considering it. It is up to our professional organizations and communities to work together and to establish and update ethical frameworks, but ultimately, it's really up to each individual to be well educated, trained, and informed about the sources of their information, the context, the story around it, as well as about the potential implications of their work results. Ethics is not what you do, but why you do it. And this concludes my presentation. I would like to really thank, again, Jack O'Connor, David DiBiase, Kevin, and also UCGIS for providing me this opportunity to share my thoughts. And if you want to contact me, this is my contact information. Passing it back to Alberto.
Thank you everybody, and thank you the presenters for your food for thought. There's a lot going on here. If again, if anybody in the audience has any question, please submit it in the chat, and we will discuss it with the presenters. Now, before we move on to some questions, anybody has any? So we heard. I'm asking the panelists. I have heard you represent 3 very, very different perspectives and organizations. One that is more related to academia, one that is more a sectional on a sector of GIScience, and then of course Charles represents the GIS professional that actually does the work on the field with real data on a real city, affecting, deciding, okay, where do we put the new pipelines or whatever. So it's very, very different. It's 3 very different perspectives. I just want to ask you, the title of the symposium is Advancing GIScience Informed Policy Solutions. And one thing that I was thinking about is how do we actually insert, from the point of view of your organization and yourself and what you've done, and Charles, for example, you work with the Oklahoma GIS Council, so you actually meet with people who actually do policy. How do you think we could insert ethics in policy? At the level of really actually formulating policy at the state, local, national, or even community, international international arena. That's my. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on
One thing that I'll mention, and like I said, I've worked on several things at everything from the local to the state to the regional and national level. And as we were drafting address standards for the state of Oklahoma and some other standards that are regional standards, we realized that you can always try to take and put a legality to what's wrong. And they can always come up with a better way to break wrong. You can always find someone who will take and break it. You can't you can't possibly put a law in that will clearly define what's wrong. So the phrase that has come to life here in the state is educate, don't legislate. You don't try to take and tell everybody the 100 ways that are wrong that you shouldn't do it. You educate them on the correct ways to do things and why it's going to be beneficial, because a lot of times it's not a sin of commission, it's a sin of omission. It's something that they truly did not understand, and if they'd have known better, they would have probably not done it. So we've realized education, that's number one. Absolutely, that's number one. Bring it to the forefront of people's minds. Have them read through it a little bit, and it's amazing what hurdles are completely avoided by just simply that first level of education. You don't really know what hiccups you don't run into, but you just realize it's a much smoother path when you do educate on a global scale, when you do educate on a profession-wide scale. So that's the real world application that I've seen deployed over the last several years, and it's functional.
If I may, I would like to add to that, kind of piggyback to what you said, because we're a nonprofit educational foundation, so I totally agree with that. We're also not allowed to lobby as a nonprofit, so it's very interesting how we can approach the policy making. And I really like the idea of education, because the way we approach that without influencing it directly through lobbying is bringing together the policymakers and the influencers, the stakeholders, so they can have a conversation, or actually more conversations, and understand each other. So creating that particular network and working with the bureaucrats. It's really important to make sure that you bring the bureaucrats who understand how those policies are being made together with those who have the solutions and ideas, and they have the technical skills and understanding. Once you bridge that gap, I think it's going to be much better, much easier to influence policy decision making. And also at the same time, we have so many geospatial organizations. I would like to bring up COGO, for example, right, as a reunion of geospatial organizations who could have an instrumental role in advancing policy making related to both geospatial overall and ethics in geospatial.
I'll just add that it's clear geospatial is in every sector of our society, government, private, education, so that these cross-sectoral conversations and dialogues are so important. That's something that we really try to do at the American Geographical Society. And then with the point about education, I am also been a professor of geography for over 30 years. And I think we still have a long way to go in bringing up some of the ethical concerns that once you maybe have a job as a GIS professional or as an analyst, maybe you actually more directly are confronted with these issues. But I think we still have a way to improve when we're training people in these tools about some of the ethical considerations. And one of the reasons why AGS is working on the Locus Charter is to come up with a set of principles that could be widely disseminated across these sectors.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Mark Armstrong in the chat. Perhaps you guys can take a look at that, and if anybody wants to take a stab at that question. And
I'll toss in there on that one. And like I said, I truly don't understand all the minutia of the details he's mentioning in here. But I will say, as I mentioned, statistics you can take and you can display things completely different. And that's one of the things that I always try to do whenever I make a map or I do anything that will be publicly seen or decisions will be made off. Bounce it off somebody else that you count as truly a professional confidant to see if they're seeing what you're trying to show. because it may be so clear to you, but you're standing in the middle of the forest and you don't see those trees. You know what you're trying to convey. The ethical considerations of spatial analysis, you try to convey this, you've got it in your mind the way that you're wanting to show it. Truly have a couple of other professionals that you count as good confidants that are educated. Bounce it off of them. Let them look at it and ask them what they see. If they see what you're trying to say, you've probably done your job correctly. But the implications for letting something out that you don't truly wasn't conveyed correctly because you did some map algebra incorrectly or different, not necessarily incorrectly, but with statistics differently, and you got results that weren't exactly what everybody else would see, and you interpret them differently, that's a dangerous ground. So if decisions are going to be made off of those maps, bounce them off a couple of your professional peers and see if you're getting your message across. Does that kind of roughly answer that question?
Anybody else want to step in? Well, that's a good one, and one that follows is it's as Marie, you just talked about the fact that in our when we are as educators, perhaps we don't talk as much as about ethics as we should do. And I'm old enough to remember there was a journal called GIS and the Law or something, GIS Law. I don't know if anybody remembers it, but it was a snapshot in time in the sense that it was, I think, in the 90s, and it was a time in which we talked a lot about these issues. I don't know if we do as much as we should. But another point, and that's the one that Mark is talking about, is we don't really do a good job, generally speaking, about metadata. And the question there is, what is the ethics of metadata, if you want? I think, to me, this is very profound questions, and relates to the question that was just asked. It's in a sense, the old adage, garbage in, garbage out, can be extended also to, what do we know about metadata? Who is creating the data, how it's created, beyond the concepts of currency or appropriateness. It's a really good point.
Yeah, I would like to add to that. It's kind of going with my presentation today as well. Many times the curator of data is not necessarily the person who produces the end product. So that's why it's so important to have the story, the context, and the process also of creating the metadata. You want to understand what the process was, you want to understand what the sources were, and how the sources were curated. So I think really in order to be more confident in the results that you're providing, it's really important to get enough information in terms of context and story that comes with the metadata to be able to provide more ethical solutions. So it's really working together, the curator, the collector, curator, and the producer.
I would add that in our workshop, when we were drafting up the Locus Charter with practitioners all around the world, things that came up were accountability. The public wants accountability. They want to see how this data was collected, how it's being shown. But often those things are so buried. It's also buried in the case of location tracking. You're accepting terms and conditions and never going through exactly all that metadata and where it exists. So I think some solutions that came up were making it easy to consume. For example, I know Apple's kind of trying to do this, but other companies have also done this table of contents of data. That's an easy to digest way for consumers to understand the metadata that's often buried in these, small print formats. How to make that more digestible to an average person looking at a map or using a service.
bring up a unique point whenever you mentioned some of the GIS aspects that society uses that 10 years ago didn't exist. 10, 15 years ago, you didn't ever think about looking at your phone, saying find the local Starbucks, and it geospatially calculating your route. That wasn't an option for the normal person who had no idea what GIS is. Now it is in their hands. So you've got a huge disparage of consumers versus producers, and the producers may have the full well intent to document and have it done correctly. But those consumers may just truly not know, and they don't care. They just want the information to be right. You as the professional have to make sure that once it leaves your hands, you have done everything to make it correct, and its lineage with metadata follow it throughout the process. So whenever you have developers that build applications off of your data, they can see that it actually does have a vetted background. It's not just someone who took and popped up on Google Earth and started dropping, place marks, but it actually, that is a dot for an address point for 911. There's an accuracy thing, there's a validity thing, there's a lot of it tied to it. So, it's not just the ethical practice of a practitioner, but it's the ethics of how you acquire and represent that data in perpetuity. That dot that you put on the map 20 years ago as an address point is probably going to be the dot that's going to be in dispatch in 10 years. It's going to be, pulling up someone's house when they have a heart attack. So it's real world stuff that you don't think about a lot of times, but it truly is tangible today.
One other thing in the presentation just Camilla gave, there is these phrase here, and it's a little bit, I don't know if I agree, or it is a kind of Karen, I didn't close a screen share just because I wanted to highlight this a moment. Ethics is not what you do, by why you do it. It's I don't know. Does anybody want to comment on this? I'm not sure. It makes me, I highlight it because it makes me a little bit uncomfortable. I understand the context, but it makes me a little bit uncomfortable.
Alberto, just to clarify, it's not to be taken ad literam. It's to emphasize the second part. Just to clarify. So the intent is to really emphasize. It's not so much to say you shouldn't do ethics, but it's to emphasize the second one. If that makes you feel more comfortable, but I'd like to hear others.
If anybody has any other.
It's funny that you keyed on that one, because I've had several discussions with a lot of GIS professionals and several throughout the ranks of GISCI. And one thing that I've always kind of held as paramount is, what's the difference between a GIS professional and just someone who does GIS for a living? A GIS individual that is their job, they may know which buttons to push. They may know how to open up ArcMap, ArcView from a couple of years ago, or ArcInfo, command line if you're a little more old school. But they know which buttons to push. The GIS professional knows why you push those buttons, and if you take that specific software away from them, it's just a tool. They can pick up another software. They know why they're pushing those buttons. They know what results they're going to get from those map algebra, spatial analysis endeavors. They know the minutia behind what they do and why they do it. So it's funny that you mentioned that, because that's spot on. It's what's the driving force, the education behind it, and that's where the GIS professional should truly lead and make those decisions. Because when you come to that fork in the road, that GIS professional knows why you take one as opposed to the other fork. It's not just a random, this one looks better. It's a educated professional decision that says this is ethically and correctly the best course of action. So I like that.
I'll just add that makes me a bit uncomfortable because I think there's a lot of times where you're motivated. The motivation might be good. You want to reduce poverty, or you want to reduce the spread of COVID with a GIS tool or analysis. But the actual process of what you're doing can actually create a whole bunch more problems. So you have, to me, you can't separate them. It's important to have a good motivating idea. What is the goal here? But you can have the great intent and have a really damaging execution. I'm not sure I would buy that distinction. I see what you're meaning, Camilla, that you have to have the intent matters, but so does the choices that a geospatial person is making.
I'm looking at it also from the context where geospatial technologies are so ubiquitous that you're having a lot of people who don't necessarily have the background, the education, the knowledge to do some of the work, because the technology is allowing for very easy to skip some of the processes very easily.
Mm-hmm.
So many of them are probably doing geospatial work, but not necessarily focusing, like Charles said. So I'm glad there's an understanding of my intent here, but not really understanding why they're utilizing it. So if that makes sense, we're really seeing a transition where the work of the geospatial professionals is being undertaken by a lot of people who are not necessarily trained and educated to do that work. And that can have serious consequences because they just execute without knowing what's before and after. So it's really important, maybe to this one, to clarify, because I understand it can create ambiguity in terms of analysis. Maybe we put something before that as well. It's really also how you do it that it matters.
Where I interpreted that, I looked at it, and in my thought, when you say, why do you do it? It's not a bias walking in going, I'm trying to get this result, or I'm trying to show this. The way that I looked at that is I have an education and a responsibility as a profession to know it's not just I embark upon a process, but I know which tools to use correctly. The why you do it is which tools to grab. It's not just grabbing something. It's knowing whenever you embark upon those tools and those methods and those statistical analysis, and are understanding that there could be bias, and you're trying to make those decisions to remove that bias. Is that what you're trying to say, Camilla?
That is much nicer, in a nicer way. Thank you.
If you look at the chat, Dennis Cow makes a point. I think it's a really good one connected to what you just said, what we just discussed, is transparency. And this is especially important, I think, in terms of policies. And so the transparency in policy making and democracy is a real important asset. And so that's a very good point. So I don't know if you want to comment on this particular, or the one that the question that Monica asks, and it's something that we have all encountered, I think, that has to do with IRB and ethical questions, and that dynamic there. If anybody wants to comment on this.
Well, I'll take Monica's question. IRBs, the institutional review boards at universities, really came from a biomedical perspective. How do you deal with blood samples and tissue? And as it's been applied to the social sciences, I don't think that they have as much understanding of spatial data and geospatial data. I mean, obviously things like you cannot share individuals' addresses, but I think the technology has changed so quickly, and the higher resolution satellite imagery. I mean, on one level, I think we could probably get things through the IRB that maybe shouldn't get through the IRB because people don't know what they're looking at. But on the other hand, I just don't think most institutional review boards at universities are really fully appreciate the potential intrusiveness of some of these tools.
In my experience, Monica, I have a good colleague in the philosophy department that specializes in ethics, and that's where I go for if I have any questions about these. You know, it's so. We still have 2 minutes, just a couple of minutes. If anybody wants to have questions, if anybody on the panelists has questions for each other, perhaps. Nobody wants to comment on everybody else's work.
Alberto, what do you think? It's like I already know about
you know, I had a job that Charles did many years ago in another continent, and I think it's and you know, and in academia we talk a lot about ethics, and in GIScience, I think it's important to hear also from you. You know, from organizations that may represent either an industry like Camellia, or another type of industry like Marie. Actually, academia is an industry too, as we know, and it's and also, you know, people that are actually doing the GIS work that affects the lives of citizens of a certain community. And so I don't have any particular, you know, I don't have any particular comment or questions. I just want to thank everybody for being here, and for the four of you to graciously accept our invitations, and for everybody who's attending for being here, and UCGIS for giving us the opportunity of talking about this. So I think we've come to 2:30, and I want to thank everybody. And if anybody in the audience wants to share want to have you know, the links or any other things about the presentation that we gave today, I think you know, you can ask me, or I'm sure even, you know, Diana, or directly the presenters today. So thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
Thanks,
Appreciate it. Thanks, Alberto. Thank you, guys. Thank y'all. It was a pleasure.